Would you rather have the card on the left or the card on the right? Now, both of these cards are extremely rare and extremely valuable, and they both come from the Creatures deck, a limited edition distribution that was given to select Nintendo employees. Let me know what you think down in the comments below, and stick around to the end of the video when we see how the market valued these two items. Hey everybody, what's up from Pokemon Classics? Reminding you all that the classics never go out of style. Today we're in for another Auctions of the Week recap video, and there are a lot of interesting items that came across this week, as well as some of the usual staples. Now I don't want to talk too long, so let's go ahead and roll into it, beginning with some vintage cards. We'll kick things off this week by taking a look at the big three, starting with this Shadowless PSA 9 Charizard from base set that sold for $7,800. Now, one of the things I think is interesting is there was also a CGC 10 copy of the same card selling for about the same price. This one went for $7,750, and although it's just one anecdotal piece of evidence, it is an interesting data point. Now, we also have a PSA 10 Unlimited Charizard, and this one sold for $12,000, and that's a pretty strong sales point considering the trend has really stabilized around the $10,000 mark for this card. So maybe Charizard's finding a little bit of upward momentum here. Next, we'll move on to Blastoise, and there was a first edition CGC 10 Blastoise that sold, and this one went for $8,700. Now, we also have an unlimited copy in PSA 10, and this one sold for $2,400, and that also seems to be a little bit up from the last few months, where the trend was really finding a place at around $2,000, maybe a little bit more than $2,000. Next, we'll take a look at some Venusaurs, and we have a PSA 10 Shadowless Venusaur. Really cool card. Those Shadowless ones are tough to grade, and this one sold for $3,120. We also have the third of the three unlimited variants in PSA 10, and this one sold for $1,050. Once again, taking a look at the chart, we can see that this is pretty much in line with where the market's been over the last few months, so nothing too abnormal there. Looking at some other vintage cards, we had a Venomoth from Jungle Set sell for $810 in a first edition PSA 10, and Victory Bell coming out on top between the two grass-type Pokemon, this one selling for $1,320 in a PSA 10. From Fossil Set, we had an Articuno, and this is one of the more difficult cards to grade from Fossil Set, and in a PSA 10, first edition, this one sold for $2,570. There was also the Dragonite, and this was a really strong sale for Dragonite, selling for $6,900 in first edition PSA 10 through PWCC. In fact, if we take a look at the chart for Dragonite, we'll see that it was stabilizing around the $4,000 to $5,000 price range, but seems to be on an uptick as of late. One last fossil card that I wanted to comment on was this non-holo rare Zapdos in first edition PSA 10, allegedly selling for $4,200, but in my opinion, this was likely a shilled auction because this card only goes for about $200. So I don't know what was happening there or why Zapdos suddenly became so popular. Looking at some Neo cards, we have a Lugia from Neo Genesis in first edition, CGC 9.5, selling for just under $2,000. It's an absolutely beautiful card, and I think a lot of people would select this one as their favorite from the Neo era. Also from Neo Genesis, we have a Meganium. This is the easier to grade between the two, and this one, first edition PSA 10, sold for $679. Now, another front runner on people's list for the best card from Neo has got to be this Umbreon. This is the original Moonbreon in first edition PSA 10. Doesn't really get any better than that, and this one sold for $5,520, which is actually a little bit below its price trend as of late. In fact, if we look at the graph, lately that's been selling for about $6,000, give or take a little bit, so this one coming in a little bit lower than usual. This week's auctions also included a number of first edition Neo Revelation cards, so we'll do a speed run through some of the highlights, starting with this Entei in PSA 9 condition that sold for an even $600. Now, the Ho-Oh also showed up in this auction, and this one sold for $630 in a PSA 9. And Raikou, one of the legendary dogs, this one in PSA 10 Gem Mint condition. These ones are really hard to grade, and they're really popular, so this one earned a premium of $4,920. Now, if we take a look at the price chart, you can see that this has dropped significantly from its all-time high at about $12,000, but it seems to be finding that floor in that $5,000 area. There was also a PSA 9 version that sold for $480, and if you notice, this is about 1/10 of the cost of that Gem Mint 10 Premium, so pretty noticeable difference between a 9 and a 10 here. The Suicune earned a little bit more at $552, and then we also have to shine a light on the Shining Magikarp PSA 9 condition, going for $588. For those of you who enjoy Legendary Collection reverse holos and the firework holographic pattern, there were also a few of those that dropped into this auction, including this Articuno in PSA 10 that sold for $1,675. Now we had another legendary bird show up, and that's the Zapdos in PSA 10 selling for $1,140, but both of these were outsold by a PSA 9, and that was the Gengar, which sold for $1,900. This is a really expensive card and a very difficult one to grade, with a low population in PSA 10. Before we move into some modern cards, let's pay tribute to the E-Series and EX era of Pokemon, starting with this Umbreon from Aquapolis. This one was a Mint 9, and it sold for $835, and it has the moon in the background. What more could you want from an Umbreon card? We also had an Articuno sell from Skyridge, and this one was a PSA 10, and it went for $861.55. Next, we got to get those holographic borders with EX Pokemon. I absolutely love this artistic styling, and the Mewtwo is a great one. This one was a Mint 9, and it sold for $218.50. There was also a Rockets Articuno EX from Team Rocket Returns, and this one in a Gem Mint 10 sold for $860. Next up, we have another iconic artwork, and this is the Lugia EX. This one was a Mint 9, and it sold for $731. We also had the Groudon EX, and this one needs some currency conversion because it sold in Australian dollars, but it came out to $926.34 in a Gem Mint 10. Another one that needed to be converted was the Flygon EX, and this one sold for $707.39 in Gem Mint 10 condition. All right, it's time for some modern, and we're going to start with some Charizards. This Charizard from Evolutions is a very difficult grade, and in PSA 10 condition, it sold for $1,140. Now, if we take the same artwork and we print it 5 years later on Celebrations, not quite as expensive at $156. In fact, you can see from the price chart here that this Charizard has been trending down pretty consistently just due to the sheer volume of PSA 10s available. Another Charizard on our list is from 151, and this one sold in a PSA 10 condition for $311. And if you like stuff that's shiny and more rainbow-oriented, we've got a Charizard from Champion's Path in PSA 10. This is a Charizard VMAX for $248.26. Another rainbow holographic background can be found on this Burning Shadows Secret Rare Full Art Charizard GX, and this one sold for $2,950. As we transition our way into another fan favorite, Eevee, this one's from Twilight Masquerade and in a PSA 10, selling for $380, which really isn't bad for a card that's this recent. We also have the Scream Eevee, and one comment I wanted to make is I think Eevee's ears are just disproportionately large to the rest of its head in this illustration, but that's just my opinion. Anyway, in a PSA 10, this Eevee is sold for $720. We also saw the Scream Pikachu sell, this one for $2,100 in a PSA 10 condition, and maybe that's because it's the franchise mascot of Pokemon, or maybe it's because its ears are more proportionate with the rest of its head. It's definitely one or the other. Anyway, next we'll cover some VMAX cards that sold this week, starting with the Gengar that ate everything. The Gengar VMAX from Fusion Strike sold for $520 in PSA 10. We've got the Moonbreon, or the Umbreon VMAX from Evolving Skies, selling at $1,127. And finally, the Rayquaza VMAX, which is my personal favorite of the VMAX artworks. This one sold for $525.61 in a PSA 10 condition. If we look at the price chart for this card, it's actually been doing really well over the last few months, and although it has pulled back in the last few weeks, it's still up noticeably from where it was back in February or March. The last couple cards here I really like for their artwork, but one is the Bubble Mew from Paldean Fates, and this one in a PSA 10 sold for $275. Now this one takes us back to Chilling Reign, and I absolutely love the Galarian Moltres. It is the best looking of the three legendary birds from this set, and it sold for $247.50 in a PSA 10. Lastly, we'll wrap it up with Snorlax, because we have to have at least one Snorlax on this list to keep all the fans happy. This gold Snorlax sold for $134.99. Next up, we have some Japanese cards, beginning with this complete set of Yu Nagaba Eevee promo cards in PSA 10 condition. Now, the full set sold for $338, and I think that's a pretty affordable price point, considering you're getting 9 cards for that price. We also have this Gengar Master Ball Reverse Holo card from 151 in Japanese, and this one sold for $183.50 in a PSA 10 condition. Now, these cards are very popular, but they've seen a lot of negative price pressure due to the extensive reprinting of Japanese 151. Now, a card that I find very visually attractive is Grand Party. It unifies all 3 legendary birds, and this BGS 9.5 copy sold for $870. Now, another card that has a very interesting visual to it is Trade Please. It's got Nightmare Fuel front, but the backside is holographic, and I think that's unique. This CGC 10 copy sold for $312. Another card that's interesting is Computer Error, and this card was reprinted as a promo in English, and it's not a very valuable card, but in Japanese, it's very difficult to acquire, and this one sold for $1,950. The next couple cards are popular ones, beginning with Umbreon from Neo Discovery, and in Japanese, PSA 10, this card sold for $405. The Lugia is also a very popular Neo Pokemon, and this one in PSA 10 condition sold for $600. Taking a look at this price graph, we can see the Lugia has been under tremendous pressure ever since its all-time highs going back to the pandemic. Right now, though, selling in about that $600 mark seems to be about right. Speaking of Lugia, we also had a JR Rally Lugia sell for $325 in gem mint condition, and another JR Rally card, this time the Mewtwo, selling for just a little bit more at $330. And I really love the artwork of this, particularly the color palette. Now it's time for some sealed product, starting out with this Luigi Pikachu promo box selling for $2,950. And not to be outdone, we have the more popular Mario version that sold for $4,750. Switching over to some vintage, we had a first edition Gym Heroes box sell for $11,900. And shout out to the seller there, TCA Gaming, one of the absolute best in the business. There was also a Shadowless theme deck that's sealed, which sold for $612, and this one usually commands a premium over the others because there is a potential of getting the no damage Ninetales from that Shadowless box. A couple Topps boxes also came to auction this week, including this Pokemon the First Movie box, which sold for $836, as well as this one from Pokemon the Movie 2000, which sold for $4,250. Looking at a couple of modern sealed products, we have the Pokemon Celebrations UPC selling for $310, and then one that's a little bit surprisingly low, in my opinion, is the Pokemon Trading Card Game Classic Collection. And this one originally retailed for $399, but is selling for about half that at $207.50. Now, I don't know if this counts as a sealed product necessarily, but I threw it in here, and this is a complete first edition base set in PSA 9. That's all the holos, all the rares, commons, and uncommons, including both Pikachus, Red Cheeks and Yellow Cheeks, and this sold for $60,000. Finally, I wanted to close this one out with a Pokemon sign because I dropped mine recently this week while organizing some things, and I broke the Pokemon logo off of it. I had to re-glue it on there. But anyway, if you were to pick one of these up, it's $316 currently at auction. Finally, in honor of Top 10 Pokemon, we'll close out this episode with the auctions of the week, and there's a couple different auctions that I wanted to feature, starting with this Creatures Deck Chansey. Now, this one has the early concept design printed on the front, and I think this is an absolutely amazing and historic card. This one sold for $18,600 in PSA 9. There's also the Charizard from the same exact deck, and this one edged it out at $21,000, also in a PSA 9. So 2 really heavy hitters there, and I believe every single card from the Creatures deck was auctioned off individually as part of that most recent PWCC auction. Now, there is one more auction I wanted to highlight, and that was this set of 3 cards from the Pokemon Creator Pack in PSA 10 condition that sold for $20,400. Now, these cards came from the Kids WB Pokemon Card Creator Pack, and they're very difficult to acquire and even more difficult to grade. In fact, I believe back in February, just the Pikachu alone in PSA 10 sold for $36,000. I don't know if that sale was ever completed or if it was even legitimate, but this seems like a pretty strong difference from that sale back then. Anyway, guys, that's going to wrap it up for this episode of Auctions of the Week. Let me know if I missed any major auctions down in the comments below. I scour a number of different websites, but I'm sure I must have missed something. Anyway, guys, I'm Pokemon Classics, reminding you all that the classics never go out of style. Stay well, everybody. Have fun, and don't forget to enjoy collecting. We'll see y'all with the next video. Bye, everybody.